Good morning, everyone, or good afternoon, depending on where you are joining us from. My name is Amy Morgenroth. I'm with the marketing department here at Untangle. We're almost ready to kick off this webinar. We're just checking on a couple of things, and if you would just give us one more minute, we will double check to make sure that everything is working correctly. I just want to make sure. Eric, can you hear me?
I can.
Okay, great. So like we said, thank you all for joining us today on this webinar. We really appreciate it. I have a quick introduction and then I will kick it over to Eric. So as we all know, network administrators are building security systems and solutions for SMBs, and sometimes there can be some unforeseen complexities that make even the most straightforward deployments really difficult. So in this webinar, we wanted to talk about some of the different considerations that network administrators should make, some advanced networking security configurations that they can look towards to kind of make their job a little bit easier when they are building out their network. And Eric is also going to highlight an SMB example and show how we're able to use Untangle NG Firewall and the Untangle Network Security Framework to connect a headquarter office or a main office to other business locations. If you do have any questions, please put them into the Q&A box and we'll answer them towards the end of the webinar. We also know that Eric is going to go over a lot of detailed information. And so because of that, we have made this presentation available for download. So you can come back to this recording at any time, but you can also download the slides as you need them. So without further ado, I'm going to hand it over to Eric.
Thanks, Amy. All right, so today, again, we're going to talk about some of the configurations that you may want to consider when you start setting up your network or series of networks using the Untangle Security Framework. We'll start with talking about just some basics around complexities that you see with modern business networks, whether it's VPN usage because of the current pandemic that we're dealing with, where everybody's working remotely from home, having small offices, having branch offices, all those different things that might come up during a deployment when you're dealing with an Untangle product line. We'll then talk about some considerations for admins as they start to build their network. And then we'll move into building the actual NG firewall configuration. We'll take a look at mobile and branch office connectivity options. And then we'll put it all together using a simple business use case to demonstrate how all this ties together. Currently, 65% of small to mid-sized businesses have 100 devices approximately connected to their network at any given time. Those devices can be anything from desktops, laptops, printers, phones, and even IoT devices like web cameras and other security devices. Additionally, there are cloud-based applications that are being used much more commonly than they used to that allow businesses to connect and communicate from any location. Some of the challenges that businesses are seeing include, building offices when they're considering how many devices they're going to need to be connected, but at the same time taking into account the fact that a lot of their employees may actually be remote and never actually need to be in an office. Media traffic in general can lead to poor quality of communication. Media traffic is including both phones, voice over IP telephones, or just streaming media in general, traffic on the network, causing latency and other problems. Networks consisting of diverse device types with no endpoint control. That's things like mobile personal devices or company cell phones. Any of those things that are not typical as far as what you would consider when you're talking about a network in general. They still need to be protected, controlled, filtered, whatever the case may be. And then, of course, internal systems need to be secure as well. But even though they have to be secure, they still need to be accessible from anywhere in the world so that the remote users can still access what they need to be able to do their jobs effectively. Some things to consider when reviewing and preparing to build a network, when considering security and connectivity solutions. These aspects of a network and some ways to optimize it include the number of devices typically being connected. A lot of solutions are looking for IP addresses, not necessarily usernames. So taking into account when you're saying number of devices or number of users, what does that actually mean? Untangle, for example, we're looking at active IP addresses on the network connecting out through our products. That may vary depending on other vendors that you're utilizing, but keeping an eye on those numbers is critical when you're trying to build an appropriate network around what you need. Types and amount of traffic that you expect on the network. If you are a upload-heavy business, maybe you're a media and graphic design company, that involves a lot of data transfer, most of it upload. So you need to remember to keep that in mind when you're shopping for your ISP, for example, or when you're doing your traffic shaping, quality of service, bandwidth control, those sorts of things. Essential applications or connections that are vital to your business. Identifying and prioritizing the applications that are absolutely mission critical for your business to be able to operate makes it that much easier when you're designing and configuring your network to be as optimal as possible. Future planning. Are you going to have additional locations? Are you going to be increasing your employee levels? All these things need to be taken into consideration as you're building your network to make sure that it's scalable. Internet providers and bandwidth limitations. This ties back into some of the other ones we've already discussed. Having the proper internet speed, having the proper internet options available, whether it's failover and redundancy or having dedicated SLA type connectivity with your ISP to make sure that you can operate. Deployment strategy. Are you implementing an on-premise, cloud, or hybrid solution? All of those are important key factors when you're building your network. Current issues or challenges that need to be addressed. This is the catch-all for the remainder of things, if you will, for what you need to keep in mind when you're building out a network. If you're creating from scratch but are already an established business, then you are already aware of pain points that may already have existed, and a properly planned network can help to alleviate those pain points moving forward, or at least can be addressed in such a way that you can mitigate or work around those issues and challenges. The network security framework with Untangle. Our framework is a best-of-breed solution, and it includes building blocks necessary to create a secure network in all aspects of your business, whether it's a local gateway in an office or connectivity to the cloud. You can see quickly with the diagram that we have features and solutions available to connect you not only to the cloud, but also to branch offices, or if you are a branch office, connecting back to an HQ. It also gives you the ability and exposure to be able to see what's going on with all of your connectivity, whether it's to the cloud or whether it's to internal systems. Okay, now let's talk about some of the things that the NG Firewall can do as far as providing security solutions. Right off top, we are a UTM and a firewall. So we would be providing you protection, encryption, visibility, and control at any point in the network that we have visibility. We provide intrusion prevention, VPN services, connectivity solutions, and more. Built-in security for small networks and IoT devices. You know, while IoT is not something you necessarily want to be filtered, it'll still be protected behind an NG firewall device because it is still a firewall. So they will not be accessible from the outside world unless you want them to be. And we also provide flexible deployment options, including on-premise solutions or directly in the cloud, depending on your need. Whether that's virtualizing it in VMware or getting your own piece of hardware to run physically on your network or one of our appliances. On the opposite end of that spectrum, you can also install directly into AWS or Azure to protect your cloud-hosted infrastructure. Some key points to consider when using the NG Firewall to build your network security framework. These are all options that are built into the NG Firewall platform and are included when you are looking in the config network section, which is where all of our layer 3 capabilities are located, which we'll take a look at more in the demonstration. Some items that we do provide: port forwards, limiting interface access, one-to-one NAT, local domain DNS, VLANs, VRRP, and as well as having the ability to take into consideration voice over IP or other protocols that may need special handling. Port forwarding. Essentially, a port forward is a way for you to send traffic going to a public IP address that you control to multiple internal servers, depending on the type of traffic being sent. We do have the option for both simple and advanced rules. Generally speaking, the simple rules cover the majority of common use case for port forwards. So commonly used ports: HTTP, HTTPS, SMTP, the ones that are used all the time, are already built in to the simple rules configuration. But we do provide you the option to use the advanced mode and then forward traffic using your own very specific criteria as needed. At any time when you're creating a port forward, the most important thing to keep in mind is keeping it simple. Fewer conditions means less troubleshooting. The fewer conditions you have in a rule, the less chance it has to fail. Now, there is an exception to that. If you need to open a port that is potentially vulnerable, or if you need to open a port to allow only specific user access, you do still have the capability to use additional conditions like source address to secure that port forward so that it's not accessible by anyone in the world and only the people that it is designed to be accessed by can access it. Now, there are some cases where you don't even necessarily need a port forward. For example, local DNS. If you're trying to send traffic to a specific internal device from another internal device, instead of creating port forwards, you may be further ahead to create a local DNS entry right in the NG firewall itself to point a given host name or URL to a specific destination, so that all you need to do then is access that in a browser, access that from a terminal, however you need to be able to quickly and easily access those services. And like with most of what we can do on the Untangle platform, we do provide you a view to quickly and easily see all session activity passing through the device for troubleshooting purposes, so that you can then easily identify if there is a problem or if something's not working the way that it's expected to be working. Moving on from port forwards, we can then take a look at NAT. So when we talk about port forwards versus NAT rules, it's important to keep in mind port forwards are designed for inbound traffic. So that's an external source trying to get to an internal service. One-to-one NAT is the exact opposite. It's a way for you to dictate what internal traffic will be presenting on the external side for its IP address. Most common use case for this is if you have multiple public IP addresses available and you want to assign specific services to present on a specific public IP. The other thing that we have as a good option for this is if you have multiple services on the same ports needing to go out on different public IP addresses. And that's one of those situations where you would want not only a port forward, but also a one-to-one NAT rule for the exact same traffic to ensure 100% of the time that the traffic is going in and out exactly the way that it is expected to. For example, you have a web server with multiple sites hosted on. With port forwards and one-to-one NAT, you would have port 80 traffic and probably port 443 forwarded in on the different IP addresses for the different hosted servers, and then going back out to ensure that the proper traffic is being served on the appropriate IP address. You would have a one-to-one NAT rule that dictates this server is always going to go out on this specific public IP address to keep it separate and still secured. Some things to consider when we're talking about voice over IP. Voice over IP is both a very simple and effective means of setting up communications, but it is also a bit of a difficult thing to deal with when you're trying to secure it. Voice over IP uses multiple ports, multiple protocols to establish voice calls and connectivity. Most of those protocols do not behave well when they're being filtered. You'll start seeing things like jitter, poor call quality, one-way phone calls where you can dial out but the person on the other end can't hear you, or vice versa. So when we're talking about voice over IP configuration, at least in our product, the first thing that we do is we bypass that traffic. Bypass your VoIP phones and or your server if it's hosted internally. Make sure that they're given static DHCP leases if you are using DHCP. Otherwise, just statically assign those IPs, because then they're easily identified, easily bypassed. Once they're bypassed, you can then also create a quality of service rule, also found in config network, to prioritize that traffic so that it has the first top priority level access to your bandwidth to ensure that you get the best quality possible in that service. VRRP. VRRP, we do hardware failover redundancy in the NG Firewall platform. Essentially what happens is you have 2 or more pieces of hardware, preferably the same piece of hardware as far as the platform itself is concerned. You know, if you're using our hardware, for example, using multiple Z6s is the best use case for this. You don't have to do that, but it's the best way to make sure that the configuration works as expected. With the VRRP, it's configured by interface. So you would need to have paired interfaces, one on each of your hardware platforms, all sharing the same IP scheme, each uniquely IP addressed, and they would then share an additional virtual IP address. The piece of hardware that is controlling resources currently in VRRP would also be controlling that virtual IP address. That virtual IP is what you would use for connectivity. If it were on your internal interface, that would be what you set as your default gateway on all of your endpoints. If it is on your external interfaces, it would be the IP that people use to connect in via port forward or what have you into the system. Some background on what VRRP is. VRRP, or Virtual Router Redundancy Protocol, is a networking protocol that provides automatic assignment of available Internet Protocol routers to participating hosts. Simplified, it is a way for multiple machines to share the same resources quickly and easily to eliminate potential downtime in the event of a failure. We do have some very extensive setup guide documentation in our wiki. It's linked here. And I strongly recommend that you take a look at that when you have some free time, because there are a lot of different ways you can configure VRRP depending on what your use case is. Moving on to VLANs. VLANs are essentially virtual interfaces. They are created as children of a physical interface. So if you need a VLAN interface on the NG firewall, you would identify the port that your VLAN switch or router is connecting into, and then create the tagged interface as a child of that interface. We support both IPv4 and IPv6 configurations for VLAN, and they can be configured as either addressed or bridged. Aside from the actual configuration itself, the rest of the VLAN configuration in the Untangle platform is actually fairly straightforward. Once the interface is created, you can use it exactly the same way that you would any other physical interface. So there's no other significant difference in the Untangle platform itself once the VLAN is created. I'm moving kind of fast. Do we have any questions at this point, Amy?
Yes, actually we do. So one of the questions, and it was just more of a clarifying question, it is, aren't what you're calling port forwards just DNAT and one-to-one NAT just SNAT? So maybe just some clarification on the terms would be great.
That is absolutely correct. Yes, a port forward is a destination NAT, and one-to-one NAT is a source NAT. That is actually an excellent way to delineate between the two of them. Yeah, that is 100% correct.
Awesome. So they can be used interchangeably.
DNAT, the port forward, one-to-one versus SNAT, definitely.
Okay, awesome. One other quick question is VRRP like a way to handle active-active redundant firewalls?
Yes. Yep, that is exactly it. VRRP is the way that it's very similar to high availability, which is similar to the active-active firewall model. Both firewalls would be active, connected, and technically listening, waiting to process traffic. So yes, it is very much similar to. The only difference is with VRRP, as opposed to a true high availability, is the session state is not retained during a failure event. So a session would have to time out and restart in VRRP. But what you find is in the modern internet, that isn't as much of an issue as it used to be. So it is a much more lightweight protocol. So we continue to use VRRP instead of an actual full high availability.
Okay, so does VRRP under VLAN, is that a way to use two separate ISPs to one untangle unit?
So you could use VLAN to use two separate ISPs for sure, but generally speaking, it's not recommended. Mainly because in order for that to work, the two ISPs would have to share a piece of equipment that's connected into the same physical interface. So you could set it up that way if you had the right equipment and the right ISPs willing to work together. But generally speaking, it probably would not work that way. And honestly, really, VRRP doesn't come into play when we're talking about separate ISPs. Each ISP connection would need its own VRRP pairing to work properly.
Okay, we just have one more question on VRRP for the moment. Does VRRP support site-to-site VPN?
That's actually a rather difficult question to answer. Technically speaking, it could, but the problems that you run into are not actually relating to VRRP itself. It's relating to the VPN technologies being used. For the most part, yes, VRRP would work, but because VRRP does not retain session state, the VPN would have to reconnect once the VRRP failover event happens. Depending on which type of VPN you're using, that is a lot more seamless than other types of technologies. For example, OpenVPN, you would see very little, if not any downtime to speak of at all on that VPN, because OpenVPN automatically reestablishes, and it is much better at handling disconnect, reconnect events than, for example, IPsec. IPsec can also do the same thing, but there are a lot more mitigating factors when we're talking about an IPsec VPN. So more often than not, during a failure event, you would actually have to manually bring down the VPN and bring it back up again on the secondary unit.
I see. Thanks for going in depth about that. I think that's a good amount of questions for now. If there's any other questions, we can tackle them after the demo.
All right, perfect. All right, so let's outline the small business use case that we're going to be looking at in the demonstration. So we have a business, a pet store. They have one home office, a headquarters, a retail location, and a second location where they offer doggy daycare and boarding services. In the retail location, there's a management office for placing orders, a loading dock for inventory, payroll and other business-related operations. The retail location also includes 2 point-of-sale stations. At the dog daycare, there is an office for 3 employees. These employees manage daycare attendance, service package purchases, and have payroll and other business operations synced with the retail location. So essentially what we have here is 3 offices that all need some level of interconnectivity. Both offices, both of the remote offices rather, need to have the access to home office, mainly as a report back in, if you will, calling home to headquarters. And daycare and retail both need to be able to communicate with each other as well because they are both point of sale. The daycare managing the daycare services while the retail location is handling all other retail services. So they need to intercommunicate, and they both need to communicate back to the home office. So the way that we would set this up is we would have an untangled NG firewall at the main retail location, acting as the secure gateway and a VPN server. You would then have untangled SD-WAN routers at the remote retail location and also at the daycare and boarding facility. The SD-WAN router would then act as a VPN access point to the main office, the home office, for filtering and also for access to business-related resources. You could set up multiple internet links to optimize performance at all locations, as both the SD-WAN router and NG firewall do support multiple ISP connectivities. You also can set up dedicated network infrastructure for the point-of-sale systems, a separate one for employee workstations, or however you need to have it configured. And then all of those would have access to whatever services are needed, whether it's out on the internet or back at the home office. In addition, both of the remote locations, the retail and daycare facilities, have the ability through the SD-WAN router to also leverage LTE connectivity for failover for continuity. In the event that there is some catastrophic issue with ISP connections, you can still leverage an LTE service to get some level of service during the outage. All right, I am going to switch over to add my screen. Okay. We are currently in the Untangled Command Center. There are a number of devices in here that we are going to use to show you how we would set up that use case. We would start in the appliances, and I do have a E6, an SD-WAN router here, and I have a couple of larger NG firewalls. For our purposes, I am going to rename the tag on this Z12. And we're going to call this HQ. This is the main office. So this is the device that lives at the main branch for this pet shop that the other 2 remote locations would be connecting into for filtering and or business resource access. And this E6, we'll use this as the retail location. We'll call this Retail 1. Now, the tagging that I'm doing in the command center is purely for identifying what those devices are to me, so that when I'm in command center, I can quickly and easily determine exactly what each device is for. It has no impact whatsoever on what the device itself is actually doing. So we'll start in the HQ device. I'll hit remote access, and it should connect me directly into that device. Hopefully. Let's refresh the screen and see if I can get it to come up.
Hey, Eric, while we're waiting,
Yeah.
I
Sure.
have a couple more questions.
Sure.
So in VLAN, how do you ensure that there is no cross traffic between VLAN 10 and VLAN 20 and the primary interface? If we can ensure it.
Yeah, so essentially you're talking about isolating traffic so that only the traffic designated to go to the specific VLAN itself can be accessed, and they cannot access the other two network connections, networks rather, that are available on that same interface. The simple answer is there is actually an option on, and I'm actually going to, while I'm waiting for this, let's just go to the demo, because I can show this to you quickly and easily. There's an option on each interface, and this option is present even on VLANs. So under Config Network, and it takes you directly to interfaces. We edit the internal interface. There's this NAT traffic option right here. With that enabled, that isolates traffic so that only traffic sharing the same subnet as this interface can communicate. You can do the exact same thing with the VLAN interfaces that are hung, if you will, on this internal interface with different subnets. And then all of them will be isolated from each other. Now, that's the easy way. Alternatively, if you need to provide some level of access, you can disable this rule and instead use filter rules. With the filter rule, you can then say source interface, and we pretend that there's a VLAN interface listed here. You can dictate, initially that these interfaces can't talk to each other. So we'll just, for argument's sake, say that GRE is a VLAN interface. GRE trying to get to internal block. We would then create a second rule, and we're going to do block test, done. Then we would create a second rule that says source address. And again, we'll just randomly pick 1.0/24. Actually, let's make it easier than that. Let's do /29. So only part of that subnet on that VLAN can have access to internal. We would then place that rule above the block rule. So then only that small portion of the subnet on, and why did that rule not save properly? So only that small portion of the subnet on the GRE VLAN can access the internal interface subnet, while the rest of it is still being blocked.
Oh, that seems like it would be really helpful, and you were able to make those changes pretty easily. So
Yes.
Can changes be made as needed, or as maybe the network grows in complexity?
Absolutely. You can stack these rules as deep as you want to, as long as you're keeping the order of the allows versus the block in, correct. So the allows come first, then the block. You can have as many of these rules chained together as you want to be as complex or simple as you want it or need it to be.
That's great. I mean, I would imagine that some content-sensitive places, so medical offices, schools, or government buildings, would probably want it to be a lot more complex than maybe some other industries.
Yes, absolutely. And, that's actually a really great use case. Healthcare especially. There are going to be levels of administration that need access to everything. And then, beyond that, only very specific people, individuals, would have access to certain systems that pertain to their job role only. You can very quickly and easily create those filter rules to designate who can access what in your systems.
Yeah, that sounds like a really great tool in creating a multi-layered security network.
Yeah.
Okay, let's see if our dog daycare and retail space is available.
Let's see. Try remote access again. There it goes. So, again, I'm logging into the HQ device first. So this device has already been configured. This business has probably already been in operation for a while, and they're just getting ready to spin up a new location. So you can easily create a policy for the retail location to restrict what access via content filters in web filter, application control, etc. So we'll do retail 1, and it is a parent of the default. And let's say we want to do web filter, and we want SSL inspector and application control. So then at this point, I would go in, configure each of those applications for the configuration that's needed specifically for the retail location to allow the POS systems to get out, to get what they need, but also restricting the employee access so that they're not, doing things that are not productive or conducive for a work environment. And then at that point, add a rule for the policy to point that traffic to them. Now, I'm not going to create a rule because I would much rather show you the different ways that this could be connected in. If you are looking to do a full content filtering solution with the SD-WAN router and the NG firewall, you're going to need to use OpenVPN. OpenVPN is the only VPN technology that we have currently to allow a full tunnel mode VPN. Essentially what that means is all of the traffic from the remote site is being sent over the VPN and then exits the main site's gateway to the internet. That allows the filtering to happen at the main site. It is currently not available in any other VPN that we leverage. IPsec does not support full tunnel mode for site-to-site at all. And eventually we will have additional options available coming soon. But for now, OpenVPN with SD-WAN router, you'd establish that VPN connection. And we'll add a new client. We'll call it Retail 1. And this is a network. And we will say that that subnet is 10.11.12.0/24. Done. Save. And then when you download that client, you can import it into your SD-WAN router at the Retail 1 location, that remote retail office. We would click this link right here. Sorry, I have this one. They've changed the order on me. Click this one for the Untangle Remote OpenVPN client. That would then give you the configuration file to import into your SD-WAN router. If I remote access the SD-WAN router at retail, go into settings, interfaces, and I would add an OpenVPN configuration. If I had downloaded that VPN file, I could browse to it here and then upload it to the SD-WAN router. And then at that point, the SD-WAN router can connect to the home office. Once that VPN is established, you then would create rules, routing rules, to dictate what traffic needs to go over the VPN and what does not. For example, you have phone systems. That traffic very likely needs to go to HQ, especially if they're hosting the phone server on site. But the POS systems may not need to go over the VPN because they're going directly out to the internet for credit card processing or what have you. They don't necessarily have to go to be filtered. So at this point, you've actually established a VPN connection between the two sites. And going back to what we were talking about a moment ago, in Policy Manager, because we've now established an open VPN connection, you would get the open VPN IP address that the retail location has connected in with and create a rule using that IP. So, source address, you would specify the open VPN IP and move them to the Retail 1 policy. And then at that point, all the traffic that you need to have filtered has been sent to HQ and is being given the correct policy to give them the appropriate level of filtering that's needed. And then it's just a matter of building out from there, essentially a rinse and repeat for the dog daycare location, set up a second SD-WAN router, and go through the same motions. Create the VPN. If they need a separate policy, create the new policy for it, and deploy it at HQ. Do we have any last-minute questions before we wrap up?
Yes, we do. We actually have a couple of really interesting ones.
Okay.
So one of the questions is, can you use filter rules? Can you create a rule to allow an open VPN connection to connect to a site-to-site VPN connection, and then open VPN to headquarters, but needs access to branch, site-to-site IP?
Yes, absolutely. You wouldn't necessarily need to use filter rules. You could, if you need to restrict the access level to specific individuals, but most of what you're talking about is actually configured in OpenVPN itself. So OpenVPN supports the mesh-style VPN network, where you have multiple VPNs connecting to different sites. And essentially, where the majority of the work is done is in OpenVPN under the exported networks. So what you would do is you would add the local subnet for each of the branches that you need to access via the VPN, and then they could all intercommunicate via OpenVPN itself. Filter rules would only come into play if you need to restrict access to those subnets after the fact.
Okay, so could OpenVPN be another way of creating a site-to-site from a headquarter to a branch NG firewall to NG firewall?
Sure, yes, definitely. Yeah, you could actually, in fact, you could even do, for example, say that you have untangles in the branches only, and you have a, I'll just pick something at random, a sonic wall at HQ. Sonic wall needs IPsec. So the sonic wall would connect to your retail branch via IPsec's full tunnel site-to-site, or excuse me, just site-to-site IPsec. And then you could actually leverage the OpenVPN connection from the retail location to the dog daycare location. So the dog daycare location could access HQ through the IPsec.
That brings up a good question then. Why would someone want to use an SD-WAN router instead of putting in an untangled device at each location?
Honestly, it's purely for cost. The SD-WAN router solution is a cheaper solution. And as long as you don't need the the decentralized filtering at each site, the SD-WAN router provides you a quick and easy way to connect that site to share filtering, as opposed to having NG firewall at each site. The other reason for having an SD-WAN router is to take advantage of the additional capabilities that the SD-WAN router has that the NG firewall platform currently does not have. That namely being the ability to route by application. The NG firewall platform cannot do that currently. It can only route by IP, port number, MAC address, those sorts of things, the layer 3 type functionality. The SD-WAN router allows you to do application level routing, excuse me.
So going back to the segmentation that we were talking about earlier, if running a multi-tenant environment, how do I segment multiple OpenVPN traffic to a specific network subnet?
That gets a lot more difficult. The easy answer is, if you need to do that, you probably shouldn't be using OpenVPN. But it is possible. It can be done. Essentially, what you would be doing is you would be establishing all of the possible subnets that need access via OpenVPN in exported networks, and then creating filter rules to explicitly block access to specific subnets within that for specific clients.
That might be another webinar topic we should explore.
For sure. Yeah, it is definitely a conversation in and of itself.
We did have a question come in for IPsec site-to-site that you were mentioning earlier. Does that not support filtering of any kind, or is it specific? Do we have to set the filtering at each site for when they talk to each other?
Yeah, so IPsec site-to-site doesn't support full tunnel, so there is no way for you to filter a remote branch from a main site using IPsec. The only thing that IPsec will allow you to do is to access resources at either location remotely. So there is filtering, but it has to be done at each site locally. There's no way to share it over IPsec.
Okay, we had another question come in, and I am not too sure we have enough time to dive deep into it, but if you have an AD server with DHCP objects or tags for specific address ranges defined there, are you able to import these network object names automatically to be used in definition of conditions for firewall, NAT, or port forwarding, etc.?
Unfortunately, not currently. We don't currently have any means of leveraging objects or groups at this point outside of the actual name itself. So if you had a group, you could leverage that group name, but any objects defined within it, if it's not a username specifically, we would not be able to leverage. That is something that we have had a number of people ask for. So I would actually very strongly recommend anybody who's interested in seeing that being an option in the future, check out our feedback site, feedback.untangle.com, and first check to see if there's already a request in place, and if there is, upvote it. The more upvotes we get, the more likely we are to actually be able to get it in place.
Yes, that's great information. We are coming to the close of the webinar, Eric. Thank you again so much for joining us today. Thank you everyone in the audience for your questions. If we were not able to answer them, you will hear from somebody from Untangle and we will answer them directly for you. Again, if you would like to check out our live demo server, please check out untangle.com. We have a live demo of both NG Firewall and our SDWAN router. You can email any of the email addresses on the screen right now if you have any other questions or want to get a demo one-on-one and talk more advanced networking configurations. So thank you again for joining us, and thank you, Eric, for leading us through the webinar.
Oh, you're welcome. Thank you all for your time.
All right, have a great Thursday, everyone.